Hello, everyone. Let's have a special radical dive into the assassination of Brian Thompson.
Yeah.
Does this act mark the beginning and a new era of propaganda of the deed?
Oh.
We've got news reports, think pieces, even forum discussions where people are trying to make sense of it all. And let's be real, this isn't some dry history lesson.
No.
This case hits close to home for a lot of us, especially anyone who's ever felt screwed over by the healthcare system.
It's a powder keg
Oh, yeah.
of emotions, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
You've got the shock of the assassination itself, then layered on top of that, all this simmering rage at the state of healthcare in America.
Yeah, I mean,
People are struggling to afford meds, getting denied coverage, drowning in medical debt.
it's awful.
It's a system that feels broken.
Yeah.
And sometimes, when systems break, people break too.
And that's where propaganda of the deed comes in, right? This idea that dramatic acts,
Yeah.
even violent ones, can be a way to shake things up, to force people to pay attention.
Exactly. It's about saying, look, we've tried petitions,
Right.
protests, voting, and nothing's changed. So now we're taking things into our own hand. It's a radical tactic, no doubt about it, with a long and complicated history.
Okay, so walk me through this.
Yeah.
What are we talking about when we say propaganda of the deed?
Right.
Where did this idea come from?
Well, it really emerged in the late 19th century.
Okay.
Within anarchist circles. Think about the world back then. Rampant inequality.
Oh, yeah.
Exploitation of workers.
Right.
Governments that seemed more interested in protecting the rich and powerful than ordinary people. For some, it felt like the only way to make a dent was to strike directly at the symbols of oppression.
So not just talking about change, but actually doing something, even if it meant breaking the law.
One of the early examples that often gets cited is Clément Duval,
Okay.
a French anarchist who robbed a wealthy Parisian and then set fire to the mansion. His argument was basically, you stole from the poor, now I'm taking it back.
Wow, that's definitely making a statement. But it wasn't always about robbing mansions, was it?
No.
Things got a lot more intense, didn't they?
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah.
In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, we saw assassinations, bombings,
Right.
all carried out under the banner of anarchist ideals. But even within the anarchist movement, there's a lot of debate
Yeah.
about whether these tactics were justified.
So it's not like every anarchist was out there planting bombs.
Right.
There were different schools of thought on this.
Absolutely.
Okay.
After World War I, many anarchist groups moved away from violence,
Okay.
focusing more on things like labor organizing and building alternative communities. But the idea of propaganda of the deed never completely went away.
It went underground for a while, but then popped back up in the 1970s
Right.
with groups like the Red Brigades and the RAF.
Exactly.
It seems like this idea keeps resurfacing
Mm-hmm.
whenever people feel like the system has failed them. Like there's no other way to be heard.
It's a recurring theme, isn't it?
It is.
And it brings us back to Brian Thompson. Was his assassination a calculated act of propaganda of the deed?
Right.
Or was it something else entirely?
Yeah.
Was it a desperate cry for help?
Right.
A personal vendetta?
Right.
Or a sign that we're entering a new era of radical action?
Oh, yeah.
These are the questions we need to grapple with.
I see. Okay.
It's tempting to look for easy answers, you know, to
right.
label it one way or another. But the truth is, it's probably a tangled mess of motivations. Maybe the killer saw themselves as a modern-day Robin Hood,
Oh.
righting the wrongs of a corrupt system. Or maybe it was purely personal, fueled by their own experience of being denied care.
We saw those raw emotional comments on LinkedIn.
Right.
People talking about losing loved ones,
Yeah.
going bankrupt from medical bills. It's a breeding ground for despair.
Absolutely.
And sometimes that despair turns into rage.
And that rage is understandable.
Yeah.
When you feel like the system is rigged against you, that your life and well-being are being sacrificed for profit, it's bound to create a pressure cooker effect.
But the question that keeps nagging at me is, does violence ever actually achieve anything positive?
Oh, that's a good question.
Does it really bring about lasting change?
Right.
Or does it just create more chaos and suffering?
It's a question that philosophers and activists have grappled with for centuries. And honestly, there's no easy answer.
Right.
There are times when violence has been a catalyst for progress. like in the fight against fascism or colonial rule. But those victories often came at a terrible cost.
And there are countless examples where violence has backfired spectacularly.
Oh, absolutely.
Alienating potential allies and strengthening the very forces it was meant to weaken.
Exactly. It's a dangerous game. And it's easy to get caught up in the heat of the moment, to believe that the ends justify the means. But we have to be incredibly careful about going down that road.
Because violence has a way of spiraling out of control, right?
It does.
It creates a cycle of retaliation and retribution. And pretty soon, everyone's lost sight of the original goal.
And it tends to shut down dialogue to make it impossible to have those difficult conversations that are necessary for real change.
So if propaganda of the deed is such a risky strategy,
right,
why does it keep popping up throughout history? Why do people keep resorting to violence when there are other, less destructive ways to fight for justice?
Because sometimes it feels like there are no other options. When you've tried everything else, when you've been ignored, silenced, and marginalized, it's tempting to lash out, to make your voice heard through any means necessary.
It's that feeling of desperation, of having nothing left to lose.
Exactly.
That can lead people to do things they wouldn't normally consider.
And it's easy to judge from the outside. To say, well, they should have done this, or they should have tried that. But until you've walked in their shoes, until you've felt that level of frustration and powerlessness, it's hard to truly understand the forces at play.
That's why it's so important to look at the broader context.
Right.
To understand the historical and social condition that create the breeding ground for these kinds of actions.
Exactly. We can't just focus on the act itself. We have to look at the system that produced it. In this case, the system we're talking about is the U.S. healthcare system. A system that's demonstrably failing millions of people.
We've all heard the horror stories. People rationing their insulin, choosing between rent and medical bills, dying because they couldn't afford treatment.
It's awful.
It's a moral outrage.
And it's not just a moral outrage. It's an economic disaster. We spend more on healthcare than any other developed country, yet our outcomes are worse.
It's crazy.
It's a system that's designed to extract profit, not to promote health and well-being.
So if we want to prevent future acts of violence, if we want to create a society where people don't feel so desperate that they resort to extreme measures, we need to address the root causes of that desperation.
Absolutely. And that means taking a hard look at the systems that are failing us. Systems like healthcare, education, housing, and criminal justice.
That's a lot.
These systems are interconnected, and they're all designed to maintain the status quo, to protect the interests of the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable.
So where do we go from here? I mean, we've talked about the history of propaganda of the deed, the ethics of violence, the brokenness of the healthcare system. But what does it all mean for you and me, for the everyday person trying to make sense of this crazy world?
I think it starts with understanding that we're not powerless. We might feel like cogs in a machine, but we have more agency than we realize. We have the power to choose how we respond to these events, how we engage with these systems, how we shape the future we want to see.
But realistically, what can one person do? I mean, the healthcare industry is a behemoth. It's got lobbyists, politicians, and billions of dollars on its side. It can feel like David versus Goliath.
It's true. The challenges are enormous. But remember, every movement for social change started with a small group of people who refused to accept the status quo. They organized, they agitated, they educated, and they built coalitions. And over time, they shifted the balance of power.
So you're saying we shouldn't underestimate the power of collective action?
Absolutely. We need to join forces with others who share our values, who are fighting for a more just and equitable world. There are countless organizations out there working on healthcare reform, advocating for patients' rights, pushing for universal coverage. We need to support them, amplify their voices, and join their ranks.
It's not just about healthcare, right? We need to address the underlying systems of oppression that create these disparities in the first place. We're talking about economic inequality, racial injustice, environmental destruction.
It's a lot.
It's all interconnected.
Exactly. We can't compartmentalize these issues. A system that denies healthcare to some is often the same system that exploits workers, pollutes the environment, and perpetuates systemic racism.
We need a holistic approach,
Yes.
A vision for a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive, not just survive.
Exactly.
That's a powerful vision. But it's easy to get overwhelmed, to feel like the problems are too big, too complex.
Yeah.
Where do we even begin?
Start small.
Okay.
Start local.
Okay.
Get involved in your community, support organizations that are doing work that resonates with you, talk to your friends and family about these issues, educate yourself, and most importantly, don't give up hope.
Because cynicism is a trap.
It is.
It leads to apathy,
Yeah.
to the belief that nothing can change.
Right.
And that's exactly what the powers that be want. They want us to feel powerless, to believe that the system is too big to fail, too entrenched to challenge.
But history has shown us time and again that even the most powerful empires crumble eventually.
That's
Change is possible. But it requires us to be active, engaged, and persistent. It requires us to believe in our collective power to create a better world.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the assassination of Brian Thompson and the idea of propaganda of the deed, I'm left with a sense of urgency, but also a glimmer of hope.
Absolutely.
We've explored some dark and challenging territory.
Right.
But we've also glimpsed the possibility of a brighter future.
A future where healthcare is a right, not a privilege.
Yes.
A future where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
Right.
A future where violence is no longer seen as a necessary tool for social change.
Wow.
It's a future worth fighting for.
And it's a fight we can win if we stand together.
Yeah.
If we refuse to be divided.
Absolutely.
If we never stop believing that another world is possible.
It is.
Until next time, stay engaged, stay inspired, stay radical.
And remember, the most revolutionary act is to believe that another world is possible.